It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Many would argue that was the most significant event in the history of the world. A man actually walked on another celestial body in our solar system. But did it really happen? Did the billions of dollars spent on the Apollo project buy nothing but a movie set? Could it be that our astronauts were trained not as space travelers, but as actors? Did the Eagle lander actually land on some barren plateau in the Nevada desert? What do the men who made the journey have to say today about charges that the Apollo missions were all a fraud? Could even the most skillful movie maker have faked mankind's most glorious hour and gotten away with it? Or perhaps, more amazingly, not tried to take credit for it? In a moment, we'll see if we can separate fact from fantasy. Did we put a man on the moon?
A mystery that cannot be explained. An enigma that defies reason. A surprising and unexpected answer. To encounter such a mystery firsthand may change your life forever. Face to face with the greatest riddles of the ages, the world's most profound mysteries reach out and touch your life in ways you never imagined possible. Extreme Mysteries.
For nearly 4 decades, the vast majority of Americans, indeed most of the world, has accepted as fact the notion that the United States developed a space technology during the 60s that allowed our scientists to put a man on the moon, not once, but several times. Recently, however, charges have been made that it was all just smoke and mirrors, a gigantic motion picture project designed specifically to fool the public into believing billions of tax dollars actually went for something worthwhile. But if America truly launched the world's first manned exploration of another celestial body in our solar system, then how is it this flag appears to be waving in what is supposed to be the airless environment of the moon? Why is there not a speck of moon dust on the feet of the Eagle lander, or any kind of crater beneath the spacecraft's powerful rocket engines? Recently, some investigators have pointed out that in all of the footage and photographs taken by the astronauts, not one single star can be seen in the black void of space. If these photographs, supposedly taken by the astronauts on the surface of the moon, were actually shot with the sun as the only light source, why are all the shadows not parallel? And speaking of photographs, how did the astronauts, using chest-mounted cameras and wearing pressurized gloves, manage to get almost perfect photographs, even when some of the subjects should have been in deep shadow? But perhaps the most puzzling question is, why are these, and many other so-called anomalies, just starting to show up now, over 30 years after the fact?
During the 60s, there were so many problems that many of us felt that we'd never be able to make the voyage to the moon. Even back then, as I watched it on television like everyone else, based on my experiences at Rocketdyne, the whole thing seemed to be phony to me. I just felt that what the world was being shown was just not real.
Is it possible that photos like these, purportedly taken by the astronauts themselves, are all faked? Why would NASA undertake such an elaborate fraud to begin with?
At the time, the Soviets had launched the first satellite, the first animal, the first man, the first woman, the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, the first of 2 spacecraft simultaneously. For every 20 hours the US spent in space, the Soviets spent 100. 5 times the experience. There was fear that Sputnik 3 might have a nuclear missile on it. So what to do in a poker game when someone else has a better hand? You bluff. And that's exactly what they did.
Was America so frightened by a small basketball-sized space toy called Sputnik that we felt compelled to try and bamboozle the world?
There's no question that the Soviet launch of the Sputnik satellite in 1957 sent a clear signal to the United States about the Soviet space superiority. Now, ironically, the United States could have launched a satellite as much as 2 years earlier, but it was low on the political priority list. Those priorities changed in October of 1957. The U.S. effort was slower than the Soviets. The U.S. Air Force, for example, had its own rocket program with its share of failures. The NASA civilian program, on the other hand, was hampered initially by politics, but by the mid-1960s had actually caught up to and surpassed Soviet space technology capabilities. The stakes were pretty high. Beside the obvious political gain of a successful space mission, space superiority translates directly into military superiority. Spy satellites, ICBMs, being able to launch nuclear weapons from orbit. Whoever controlled space could conceivably control the planet. That was the atmosphere in which NASA developed the Apollo moon landing program. It's also the atmosphere in which, despite some people's claims, NASA did send 12 men to the moon and did indeed return them safely to Earth.
NASA couldn't make it to the moon, and they knew it. In the late 50s, when I was working with the Advanced Design Group at Rocketdyne, they determined that the chances of getting to the moon safely and back were 17/10,000%.
The newly elected president, John F. Kennedy, barely a year in office, seemed to take the launching of Sputnik as a direct challenge and responded with a challenge of his own to both NASA and the American people.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Hopeless or not, the president's goal was etched in stone, and great flurry of activity quickly surrounded NASA as they turned the focus of all their programs toward reaching the moon. Many Americans can still remember the heady atmosphere that suddenly characterized the space program with its new brand of heroes. Project Mercury, already underway at the time, gave the U.S. its first experience with humans in space. By 1965 and 66, Project Gemini was providing experience in long-duration spaceflight, extravehicular activity, and the rendezvous and docking of spacecraft. Unmanned programs were also an important part of the preparation. Project Ranger gave American scientists their first close-up images of the moon. The Surveyor project provided images from the moon's surface and analysis of the chemical and mechanical properties of moon soil. And the Lunar Orbiter photographed the entire moon from a low-altitude orbit, looking specifically for landing sites for the Apollo lander. At least, that was the official version of what was going on. Is it possible that all of this was just eyewash, designed to fool not only the public, but the media as well?
I really believe that the body of existing evidence proves that we never went to the moon. There is no doubt in my mind that we did not have the technology to go in 1969, and we certainly do not have it now. After President Kennedy's foolish announcement, NASA undoubtedly continued with the actual missions, but they had a backup plan. It was the Apollo simulation project, and NASA hired the best man to direct it, Stanley Kubrick. They also had more and better equipment for filming anything than all of the movie studios in Hollywood combined. Stanley Kubrick, who had just filmed his own movie, 2001, was the ideal man to do the Apollo fake film. You see, he had access to global aerospace technology, and all the firms that participated in his own film, 2001. So it was ideal that Stanley do the Apollo fake film. Apollo 11 was completely bogus, but it was masterfully staged. Collins, Armstrong, and Aldrin were loaded into the Saturn V rocket, which took off, and they simply disappeared. Then, while they were allegedly on the way to the moon, the video presentation by NASA was shown to the public. But this, of course, was completely fake. Then, after being transferred into a C-5 airplane, the 3 astronauts were parachuted back into the ocean in the Pacific for a successful but fake landing.
Could it be that everything we saw and heard on that historic day was no further away than this? Stanley Kubrick, of course, is now dead, and therefore can't be reached for comment. But if he did stage what is arguably the most spectacular film event of all time, why wouldn't he want to take credit for it? Could the film even have been made with 60s technology and in just a matter of months?
When I began looking into the accusation that the moon landings were fraudulent, I didn't believe it myself. I was a big fan of the space program, and as a kid had several pictures of the moon landing on my wall for years. What I did discover was a previously unseen reel of footage from the first mission to the moon of the astronauts actually staging part of the photography.
Stanley Kubrick was a perfectionist. This is evident in all of the films that he made, including the Apollo fake film. However, even though he paid close attention to details, he was unable to convince investigators who found errors in his film. But despite this, he was still able to convince millions of people throughout the world that we really did go to the moon.
Despite some people's claims, NASA did send 12 men to the moon and did indeed return them safely to Earth.
But if that's true, if every detail was taken into account, how is it that this masterful fakery was uncovered? What was overlooked? Did the NASA scientists make mistakes that today's space scientists are just now bringing to light?
The Soviets did not have the capability to track deep spacecraft until after Apollo 17, the last mission to the moon. Once they achieved that technology to track the spacecraft, the last 2 missions were scrubbed. Now, if the Soviets found out later that the moon missions were staged through espionage, at first glance you might think that they would blurt this out to the world, but I don't think so. They have this morsel worth a tremendous amount of power and influence.
In the 30 years since Apollo 17, the Americans have never sent men back to the moon. We've sent probes, but never any men. There are a lot of reasons for this: political, monetary. For one thing, the government doesn't feel that we need to go back to the moon. I might disagree, but the real reason is money. It would cost many hundreds of billions of dollars to go back, and I don't think the taxpayers would put up with that.
What is there about the event, seen by millions the world over, that calls into question the astronauts, the visual evidence, and the science? And what does NASA have to say about all of this? There is little argument over the fact that President Kennedy considered his call to send men to the moon a top priority. About a month after the president had faced down Khrushchev over missile bases in Cuba, he had a meeting with James Webb, then head of NASA. He bluntly told NASA officials that scientific advances came second to the political benefits of landing on the moon.
But this is important for political reasons, international political reasons, and for this is, whether we like it or not, an intense race. We get second.
This intense pressure, according to the hoax theorists, was the impetus behind the creation of a plan to do on film what couldn't be done in reality. But if the film idea was only designed as a plan B, so to speak, what makes these investigators think NASA actually didn't put a man on the moon?
There are dozens of reasons why Apollo may be considered the biggest hoax of all time. And yet one of the best reasons is the fact that the astronauts did not bring back any photographs of stars, nor did they even comment on stars, despite the fact that trillions of stars blazed down through the lunar sky. The photographs returned by the astronauts show a completely black sky.
This is usually the first thing mentioned by the conspiracy theorists, which is funny because it's really their silliest argument. We have to remember, the moon is not the Earth. On Earth, our sky is bright during the day because our thick atmosphere scatters sunlight. The moon has no air, so the sky is black even during the day. Now, if you want to take a picture of a white object on a brightly lit landscape, You have to use shorter exposure times and close the aperture down on the camera to let as little light through as possible. Stars are faint, and they're just too dim to be recorded on film under those conditions. Even here on Earth, if you go out on the darkest night imaginable and take a picture using the same camera settings that the astronauts used, you still won't see any stars.
Of course, the lack of stars in the astronaut photographs is only the beginning of the controversy. There's also the matter of the lunar module actually landing on the surface of the moon. Did retro rockets fired by the astronauts bring it gently down? Or was it, as some suggest, simply placed on the set?
We have to remember that the lunar lander's engine developed 10,000 pounds of thrust. At Rocketdyne, I saw engines of this capability so powerful that they rolled rocks across the canyon. A 10,000-pound thrust engine would have created an enormous hole down to bedrock. Its 5,000-degree temperature would have melted the lunar soil, and it would have thrown up an enormous dust cloud. But there is no evidence of a disturbance beneath the lunar lander. This is all the proof you need that Apollo was a giant hoax.
The full 10,000 pounds of thrust was only necessary well above the lunar surface. As they slowed as they approached the lunar surface, they could throttle back to about 2,500 pounds of thrust, which was all they needed to balance the weight of the lunar lander in the lunar gravity. That's about the same weight as a car here on Earth. Now, if you take that 2,500 pounds of thrust and spread it out over the engine, that gives you about 1 pound per square inch of pressure on the lunar surface. That's about equal to what the astronauts' boots were exerting on the lunar surface, and you'll notice they didn't blast a crater in it every time they took a step.
One of the scenes that stirred the hearts of Americans during the original broadcast of the moon landing was the planting of the flag on the moon. Could it be that that very event now labels the whole project as a hoax?
One thing that is certainly clear is that there's no atmosphere on the moon, no wind of any kind. And yet, in some rarely seen footage that NASA has not re-released since the mistake was caught, you can clearly see portions of the flag that appear to be moving on their own. Either the flag is alive or there's some wind. I speculate that it was air conditioning used to cool off the astronauts under hot studio lighting.
There's no doubt that Kubrick was highly attentive to details. You can ask any actor who's worked with him. He would reshoot scenes dozens of times. Any error as big as a flag waving on the set, for example, and he would have reshot that scene. In the astronauts' footage from the moon, you can indeed see the flag waving, but that has nothing to do with a breeze blowing. It's actually because the flag was attached to a flagpole. The astronauts would rotate that pole to try to drive the tip into the lunar surface. As they rotated the pole, the top of the flag would spin with it, and the rest of the flag would follow along in a wave. As a matter of fact, on Earth, where we have air, when you rotate a flagpole, the air resists the movement of the flag, air resistance. But on the moon, there's no air, so when the flagpole is rotated, the flag can flap up even higher, which you can see in the astronauts' video. You can see a ripple in it, but it's not caused by the flag waving. It's because the astronauts didn't fully deploy the flag. They left a drape in it, like a living room curtain. They thought it looked better that way.
In the process of his own investigation into the Apollo program, Bart Sibrel requested all the footage and photos available from NASA. Nestled among the reels was one that proved to be quite a surprise.
Just before the completion of my documentary, I discovered a never-before-seen unedited tape of behind-the-scenes photography from Apollo 11. It says on the screen, "This is not for public distribution," in big letters. After viewing the tape, you figure out why, because they're doing multiple takes of false photography of the mission dated 3 days into the flight. It didn't take long to discover why NASA did not want this tape seen by the public. On the tape, the astronauts are clearly falsifying part of the mission photography. This is raw, unedited footage of the crew of Apollo 11 staging part of their mission photography for playback later. How do I know this? Because they tell us so in the conversations that they were having that they assumed would be edited out.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get the playback, we can sort of correlate what we were seeing. Thank you very much.
What's more, the reel is slated and dated. July 18th, 19th, and 20th, 1969, the very days of the mission in which they were supposed to be approaching and achieving lunar orbit. And there's another problem. Armstrong's state said he is 130,000 miles out, or halfway to the moon, and that they only have one window that faces the Earth and it's blocked with the TV camera. If the window were completely filled up with the TV camera, if he were telling the truth about the position of the camera and him being halfway to the moon, then how could an astronaut's arm get between the camera and the Earth as it does in this outtake? If they genuinely went to the moon, why would they be faking any part of it? And if they're faking being halfway to the moon, then that means they could not go halfway. They could not leave Earth orbit. And if Apollo 11's equipment cannot leave Earth orbit, how could Apollo 17's equipment, which was identical?
In low Earth orbit, a spacecraft's velocity depends on its altitude above the surface, but it's usually about 17 or 18,000 miles an hour. That's about 5 miles per second. At those speeds, weather patterns and ground formations would be streaming past the window at a pretty good clip as the astronaut looks out down on the Earth. The Apollo 11 shot of the Earth in Sabrel's film shows zero movement. That's a clear indication that they are not in low Earth orbit.
The arguments rage back and forth with neither side appearing to give an inch. So how do we determine whom we believe? Is there any way we can know for sure exactly what happened?
You have to remember, American astronauts walked on the moon not just once, but on 6 separate occasions, and they did not come back empty-handed. The astronauts brought back about 800 pounds of rocks from the moon, which have been studied by geologists from all over the world. It's clear they were not manufactured in some secret NASA lab, but they did indeed come from the moon.
The moon rocks are real, but not from the moon. They were manufactured here on Earth in a NASA ceramics laboratory. They have high-temperature ovens where they can create any type of rock desired. It's very simple to do, since no one has any moon rocks to compare them with. All you have to do is make up a batch and say, "Hey people, look at all the moon rocks we've got." After all, with $30 billion, it's not hard to do exactly what you want.
It is a federal crime to be in possession of a moon rock, oddly enough. All the people who examined them are, of course, members of the government. Either they manufactured them, or perhaps they sent an unmanned probe to the moon to retrieve some authentic lunar rocks. In either case, it's not really very supportive of whether or not someone has been there.
The questions are still there. Did we send men to the moon? Or was the Apollo program just a giant hoax? If Apollo 11 was faked, were all the missions faked? And is there any way to know for certain?
Of course we went to the moon. We have evidence here on Earth in the form of the moon rocks, which geologists are convinced did come from the moon. But there's also evidence the astronauts left on the moon in the form of reflectors, mirrors, which reflect laser light beamed from the Earth to the moon and back. These reflectors are still being used today to determine the distance to the moon. And one other thing. The Russians sent several unmanned probes to the moon, which returned about 100 grams of lunar soil. These soil samples match the Apollo moon rocks exactly. Now remember, the reason we went to the moon in the first place was to beat the Russians. If they had found any evidence of fakery, they would have blown the whistle immediately.
Is this then the final proof? Can we now say with certainty that the Apollo program did exactly what many of us saw? For those who are convinced the moon landings were a hoax, there appears to be very little that can change their mind.
Nothing could convince me now. You couldn't show me a thing.
But other investigators find the whole idea that NASA or anyone else could actually create the Apollo missions on a soundstage somewhere, anywhere, simply preposterous. What do you think? Have men actually walked on the moon?